A Social History of Segregation in Trenton, New Jersey. Our journey begins in the late 19th century with the rise and fall of slavery and prejudice of blacks against whites in the United States of America. This hatred transferred to many urban areas in which whites were regarded as more elite than blacks. One of the distinct cases that fueled this belief in urban areas was the famous Plessy v. Ferguson case, in which a black man, Homer Plessy, was forced to sit in the labeled colored car of a train. The court ruled this case separate but equal, but this ultimately caused more problems than solved them, as separate but equal is inherently unequal. The Jim Crow laws and racism continued to pervade over the years into 1944, leading to the Hedgepeth-Williams case. Two mothers of black children, Gladys Hedgepeth and Berline Williams, fought civil rights to have their children attend a school with white children closer to their house. The black school their children were forced to attend was very far from the house, and the children had to walk over 2 miles each day to reach it. As a supporter of educational rights, Mr. Lawrence Fever states, "If we ask our children every morning to pledge to liberty and justice for all, then why are we not providing equal opportunities for all kids?" As a result, Hedgepeth and Williams fought the case and won, having the school renamed after them. This helped sprout other cases along the way and fueled the NAACP, specifically acting as a precursor to the Brown v. Board of Education case. Famous Brown v. Board of Education case of Topeka, Kansas in 1954 declared state laws establishing separate public schools based on race to be unconstitutional. This case acted as an inciting incident to the desegregation of many public and social institutions, and overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson case of separate but equal. This case prominently ended the de jure segregation of schools, as going back to the Hedgepeth-Williams case, this creates a sense of civil rights in education and proves education to be a prime motivation for civil rights. The de facto segregation in Trenton was also developing, as Levittown, one of the first planned communities of housing, was initially segregated. During this time, practices such as redlining, or the placement of houses in specific areas, and steering, in which real estate agents only showed people of different ethnicities certain houses, occurred. This acted as restricted covenants to the blacks of New Jersey. Thus, these practices also fueled the movements for the NAACP to access equal rights for people of all ethnicities, as the table shows the increase in the percent of non-white population. There is, however, one common boundary that people of all backgrounds found solace through, and that is music. Genres such as gospel and jazz music strongly pervaded the Trenton community during these times and helped people connect with one another despite the hatred. For example, the girl groups that emerged from 1958 through 1966 appeared to be so interesting in that young musicians for the very first time were breaking through and expressing themselves. However, many of these girls felt like puppets of high power, such as Nona Hendrix, a member of the Bluebells. As she states, "I was 15 years old. What do I know about conflict of interest in making a record deal?" During the 1970s and 80s, there is also a movement of jazz to funk music. Instant Funk, a music group that began at Trenton Junior High School in the mid-1960s, emerges and reinforces the new natural feel of music, seen in funk, R&B style of music. This type of music poses syncopation and a promotion of the funk feel. Also during this time, mainstream social protests were lowering as counter-protest movements through the essence of funk music fueled the social control movement. This evolves in the mid-1970s, which is commonly known as the disco era. The funk and disco transition mirrors the transition of America during the height of the Jim Crow laws, declaring segregation from the 1890s to 1960s in relation to the 1970s of the continued civil rights movement. Many saw this as frustrating, as tensions also heightened during this time, according to Trenton musicians Tommy Passarella and Gilbert Toth.
And in the 1950s, it suggests that there were a lot of issues in the city, lots of concerns about gangs, poverty, neighborhood tensions, and there was a whole debate about what's the best way to deal with some of those issues. Do you remember those kinds of issues coming up?
Sure.
During your youth?
Absolutely.
And did the arts, some of the arts and recreation programs that you talked about, did you see that as?
That was very beneficial because, again, it gave us exposure to other folks from across the city. Black, white, Asian, Jewish, Italian, Polish, Yes, and you learn to, you have to celebrate differences in people, not just tolerate. So when you interact with those folks, you learn something new. And yes, there was tension. Of course, there was more tension in the 60s. I was teaching at the time when the riots, both in 67 and 60, I think it's 68 or 69. Yeah, 68, yes. And again in 70, actually.
Even this was observed again in the 1980s with regards to education. In 1985, the Abbott School Districts formed, which are public schools in New Jersey that are the result of the case Abbott v. Burke, in which children of all income levels receive a public education, in accordance with the New Jersey Constitution Clause, which states that all students are entitled to an education. Tying in again with the residential aspect, property taxes were also assessed at this time to fund school districts, putting the whites at a more elite level than the blacks. Children in the urban education system at this time in Trenton still experienced some sort of segregation, but they also took an interest in those different than them in a positive, yet also negative manner.
An interesting thing that I noticed.
Nice.
One of the other students in my group happened to be, she was Japanese, and the students actually really seemed to kind of be drawn to her.
Okay.
Asked her a lot of questions about her culture, and I don't know if it was just because, it was interesting because in Trenton at that time, the black population was the majority. She was clearly the minority in our
Right.
group, and it was kind of interesting to see how they kind of, embraced her in a way.
Really,
It was
right.
interesting.
Overall, music simply connects people in times of despair and times of triumph. It is an escape to problems and a savior for many, saving many from the violence, gangs, and harsh segregation that penetrated from Trenton. Today, Trenton is still impacted and driven by music, and music pervades instead of race.